Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be delving back into one of our favorite subjects here on this show, history. Not just the kind of history you read about in history books, not dry and out of date like that. No, tonight we'll be talking about live history. Our guest tonight is Leslie Goddard. She is a history presenter. Leslie, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
So let's talk right up front about what exactly is a history presenter.
I know.
What do you do?
Because there is no good term for it. What I do is to portray women from the past as if they have come to today and they're talking to people. So it's done in costume of the time period, often using the characters' words if I can use them, and doing, I present for libraries and museums and a lot of retirement homes, places like that, but doing essentially about an hour-long performance. It's really sort of like it's a one-woman play, basically.
A one-act, one-woman play,
A one-act, one-woman play.
And you do this professionally, right? This is
I
how
do,
you make your living.
This is what I do full-time, yeah.
First of all, I want to commend you on being able to do something like this as a full-time profession. It's a very hard thing to do, so being able to make it work is a credit to your ability.
Well, I'm very lucky.
I know that you have had the foresight to bring some photos
I did,
of
yes.
some of the characters you play. So
Yes.
why don't we take a quick look at those, and then we can talk a little bit more
Sure,
about the characters
absolutely,
themselves.
and it gives you kind of a nice idea of the range, of the difference of these women that I do. This is Bertha Palmer, the great Chicago. She was a socialite. She was an art collector. She was the chairperson of the Board of Lady Managers at the World Columbian Exposition.
Palmer.
Wife of Potter Palmer, of the Palmer House
Palmer
Hotel,
House,
and
yes.
State Street and the Gold Coast and many, many other parts of Chicago. So that is Bertha Palmer. This one's slightly better known. This is Jackie Kennedy, which was actually commissioned for me. Someone asked me if I could create a portrayal, and I thought, but I did it, and
it was successful, I'm sure.
It's been very, very interesting, as they all are. This is a woman much less known. This is Mary Chestnut, who was a diarist in South Carolina during the American Civil War, wrote a diary that is phenomenal, one of the best ideas of what it was like living in the South.
And she kept it through the entire period of the war?
Through the entire period of the war, yes. She was married to someone who was he was a brigadier general in the Confederate Army, and very high up in the Confederacy, an aide to President Jefferson Davis.
So she had a unique perspective on what was happening from the top and the bottom.
Yes, right? Exactly. This is another woman not so well known. This is Violet Jessup. She was a stewardess on the Titanic, and then, amazingly, was on the Titanic's identical sister ship, the Britannic. That one hit a mine during World War I and sank, and she survived that, too.
Both.
So she survived both of these amazing disasters. And no one asked her about her memoirs until years later. They
she was a woman.
Published.
It couldn't have been important,
She was a stewardess.
Right?
She was not a wealthy first-class passenger. This is Jane Austen, which is a new program for me, and a new style, too, because I'm presenting Jane Austen and about 8 of her female characters. So that's great fun. And this is the character I'm actually creating at the moment, which is Amelia Earhart, who is set to debut this fall. So another new character.
Quite a cast of characters, in fact.
Very different and very, I always say, they're either people you don't know or you think you know, but maybe really don't.
Well, I would think that that's really true generally about historical characters, because they take on a historical persona that's related to but not identical with the person they really were, right?
Exactly. And I actually feel that way really strongly about Jackie Kennedy, because when I took on that character, I thought, is there something new, to say about her? And I found, or what I find really fascinating about her, is she had this public persona, which was very regal, very classy, aristocratic, and that was very real. I don't think that was a put on or anything. But she also had the side of her, which tended to only come out in private, that was very funny. She had a biting sense of humor, could get exasperated, could be very human. And someone said it was almost like being on an airplane where they close and open the drapes between first and second class. It was almost like she would, open up the gates and the real person be there, and then she would close it, and it would be the public persona. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting way to kind of think
Well,
about a person.
wouldn't that be true, though, I would think, of the royal family in Britain, for example?
Yes.
Anyone who is forced to lead a very public life
Absolutely.
would develop that public persona.
Absolutely.
Politicians develop it, some not so successfully.
Right, right.
But yeah, I would think you would kind of have to have that. Even
Yes.
movie stars, right?
Yes.
To have a public persona and then the person that they
And
really
then
are.
the real. And in a lot of ways, that's what got me interested in doing this kind of a thing, because when you present a person in character, you almost have to see the person behind the public mask, because they're right there in front of you, talking and reacting and things like that.
So what is it about the character? I mean, you are not only a trained actress, but you are a historian, right?
Right, yes.
And I think that's a very interesting combination.
It is.
Because
It is.
you're not just bringing the characters forth for entertainment value. You're talking about something historically relevant, right?
I do, yes.
So what is it about this personal side that you feel adds to the history?
You know, and it's so funny you say that, because Barbara Bonella, who does a very similar thing, she does wonderful, wonderful book reviews, and she said, I think of myself as an academic entertainer. And I thought, what a great way to describe it, because it is. There is this academic side to it, and then there's also the entertainment side. And I think that's almost why I don't tend to like the word impersonator. And there are many, talented impersonators, people who call themselves impersonators.
Like
but
Elvis
I think of that
impersonators.
Elvis impersonators, Marilyn Monroe impersonators, who do a terrific job. But I think of them as maybe more weighted towards the entertainment end of it. And I think what I'm aiming for is a little bit more on a little more balance with the academic side, the question of something about this person that we don't know or haven't experienced. So, for example, the Titanic character that I do, her name was Violet Jessup, had this unique angle on the whole disaster, because she was taking care of the passengers. And this is actually, I use the stories from her memoirs. And she talks about how demanding these passengers were.
Well, these were the creme de la creme, the richest of the rich.
She was working first class. So these were the people who would say to her things like, oh, it's so hot out on the deck. Would you feed my little dog, Teeny Weeny, and make sure you get some fresh peas and mash them up really well? She doesn't like them whole. That kind of demand. And then when the disaster comes, she has to deal with this question of how do you avoid the panic? How do you get people into the lifeboats? And then she describes what it was like to sit in this boat and listen to the screams and know that there's no way you can go back. She was in a boat that was, she said, completely full. They would have been swamped. And I thought, that feeling out there, you can get it in a book, but you can really get it when someone's telling you the story of it.
From
as
her own
if
memoirs.
They are right there. Yeah.
Now, I'm surprised that she was saved, because she would have been simply an employee.
Right.
And there were wealthy people who did not survive.
Very much.
So how did she manage to get a spot?
Her story was that she was asked by one of the officers to get into a lifeboat because, and it was about, the disaster happened at 11:45. The ship went under at about 2:20. She said this was about 1:30, so
it was
near
well
the
in,
end.
yeah.
And she said there were some third-class women in the area. They refused to get in the boat. They didn't think it was safe. So she says one of the officers told her, could you get in, show some of these women that it's safe? But the other thing was, out of a total crew of almost 900 people, there were 23 female crew members. So she was really, it was a new field for women to be in. She was
Now,
fairly
would
new.
she have been treated especially well as a female crew member, or not well?
Not necessarily very well. I mean, most of the crew members were British, and there was a very strong class system among the Brits. She was born to Irish parents. She was working class. So no, not necessarily a whole lot of gender privilege going to her.
But you would think that,
But some.
nonetheless she would have been a pioneer because
Yes.
she was taking a job that had
She
been
was.
previously held by only men.
Absolutely.
They were the stewards. She was one of
Absolutely.
the first stewardesses.
She
right?
was, and it was a changing time period because more and more women were taking these ships by themselves, you know, sort of unescorted by family members, and it wasn't quite right to have a male steward taking care of solo female passengers. So the ship lines were realizing they needed to hire more women, and of course that accelerated with World War I, and changes in immigration just completely changed.
But she would not have been saved because she was a female member of the crew. It was
Not
because of this
necessarily,
trying to
right.
help the other women
Right.
get on board. Right?
Exactly. But you know, there were a number of even male crew members who were saved because you couldn't load up one of these lifeboats with all female and children passengers and have it go out with no man on there at all. So a number of male crew members survived.
Because they
Firemen,
had to
lookouts,
guide the ships or guide the
you
boats,
had to
right?
have you know, there was a sense that you had to have a man in
Right.
every lifeboat to, you know,
be the captain.
to be the captain, and to row. I mean, it was.
Well, sure.
It was.
right. It was going to
you
take
know,
some strength
no
to move
motor
those
power
boats.
on those, but yeah, yeah.
So how did
absolutely.
she survive the Britannica?
She, that was a very different thing. That it hit what a lot of crew members thought was a torpedo, but historians today generally, for the most part, believe it was a mine. And it sank very, very quickly, but it was not a full ship. They were supposed to take on, it was a hospital ship during the war, and they were supposed to take on wounded men that afternoon. So if it had happened that afternoon when they were coming home, they were
Many
off the
more
coast of
fatalities.
Greece. Oh, it would have been a terrible disaster. But as it wasn't a full load. They were able to, and actually by the time she got up to the lifeboat deck, most of the female crew and staff had already left in the boat. So she went to the boat assigned to her, and she happened to get in this lifeboat. She made it to the water, and then, this was the horrible thing, the captain was steaming the boat forward. As the propellers were coming out of the water, it was sucking the lifeboats
back
into
in.
them, and several lifeboats got shredded, and Violet was in one of the boats getting sucked back, and she had to jump in. I mean, she's a great storyteller, so it's a fabulous story. She didn't know how to swim. She'd had tuberculosis as a child. She had to jump in the water.
You
and
couldn't make this up.
No, you
This-
couldn't. No one would believe it.
No fictional
No
character
one
could
would
do
believe
this.
it if it hadn't. In fact, there was a third ship. There were 3 sister ships, and Violet was on the third ship, the Olympic, and that one had a major disaster. A Navy cruiser rammed into it on the side, and the ship survived. But she was on that for that disaster, so she was on all 3. No one
Now
would have
today she'd be
believed
a
it.
study in post-traumatic stress disorder,
I
right?
know, right,
But
exactly.
somehow she
exactly.
came through and
She
wrote
came
about
through,
it.
Went back to sea. She worked until 1950, and no one interviewed her until 1970 when John Maxtone Graham interviewed her for something else,
And discovered this.
and she happened to say, "Oh, I wrote my memoirs years ago. They're up in the attic," and he worked for years to get them published. So
Remarkable.
thank goodness, yeah.
So coming back to you and your
yeah.
portrayal of these characters, so I can see why this character in particular is so fascinating. to you.
Yes.
And relatively obscure.
Yes.
So is this something other than, of course, Jackie Kennedy and Amelia Earhart,
Right,
but is it
right.
something that you like to do, is find the kind of out-of-the-way character and
I
find out
do,
what's...
and I'm fascinated by the question of why do we remember some people and not other people? Because if you look at Amelia Earhart, she was not the best female pilot of the day. She had some incredible luck. You know, she got chosen to be the first female passenger ever to ride an airplane across the Atlantic, and that was sheer luck. She parlayed that into incredible fame and was a incredible, she was a really great mix of incredible fearlessness and very, very savvy at
Self-promotion.
promoting herself. Really, she really was. She was self-created in a really admirable kind of a way.
Now today we could look at, I always think of Madonna when I think of the self-promotion geniuses.
Right, right.
Who, at least in my opinion, is of limited talent, but is brilliant at promoting herself as a brand.
Yes.
And so, but today there's a kind of looking slightly askance
Right.
View of that.
Right.
Right. But was that seems like that was different for Amelia Earhart.
It was in a little way because publicity managers were not well known at that time. She happened to get picked up by George Palmer Putnam, who was a publisher, Putnam family, well-known name to this day. And he actually had gotten Charles Lindbergh to write a book about. And so he was kind of involved at the beginning saying, if I could get a woman to fly the Atlantic and write a book about it,
this would sell.
This would sell and this would be good. So he was involved in locating her. He found her. And once he realized that, you know, she was the perfect person for that job because she was fairly modest. She was not a, you know, self-aggrandizing type person. She was a wonderful promoter of other women in aviation. And so in some ways she very much fit a sort of certain feminine stereotype, she was the all-American girl. She was very sweet, very funny, very photogenic. On the other hand, she was an unbelievable risk taker and very adventurous.
As you say, fearless.
Fearless. She really was. She would, you know, which is probably what ultimately caused her.
But she couldn't have accomplished what she accomplished without that.
Right. Yes. So she was a brilliant balance between sort of feminine, masculine, modest. And I think George Palmer Putnam recognized that. He became her promoter even after that, and then ultimately they got married, and it was a brilliant partnership for both of them.
So when you portray Amelia Earhart, what is the historical message that you're trying? Because I know all historians, you want to relate history to the present.
Yes.
What do we learn from the history to make use of today? So what is that lesson?
You know, I always say, I always call that program Finding Amelia Earhart because so much of the concern about her today is what really happened. Yes. Where is she? And you know, I think. In
fact, didn't somebody just recently? Didn't they think they found her plane?
Think they found it, but then there's other historians who say no, it couldn't be. And there's, and I kind of feel like that whole debate over what's the real story of how can we really find out what happened kind of obscures the fact not obscures, but obscures what I think is the more interesting story, which was who was this woman? Who was she really? That's much more interesting. You know, she was. Her best friend said to her, I don't think anybody knows who you really are. Her father was an alcoholic. The pilot of the plane that she flew across the Atlantic on the first time, he was an alcoholic. And her navigator on the final flight was an alcoholic. And
was she herself?
No, she very much abstained, at least as far as we know. But she was very good at that kind of working, that kind of, not that I'm any expert on, families and living with alcoholics, but that kind of taking care of someone, pushing, doing what needs to be done.
Being the strong supporter.
Being the strong one, being the one out in front, being the one who gets things done. And that kind of drive to achieve, to, make good. Her father could never hold down a job and make good on something. And that drive to take care of her family. She was supporting her mother and her sister for a long time.
In an era when women weren't able to do that generally, right?
And she was very driven by the idea of getting opportunities for women. She had a scrapbook when she was in her 20s, just of accomplishments of women that she found articles in newspapers, put them in a scrapbook. She was an advisor, so the president of Purdue University came to her and said, we'd like you to come here. What would you like to do? Do you want to teach about piloting? And she said, no. I want to be a counselor to women, female students, about what they can do. That was really driving her. And,
now that's interesting because that wouldn't necessarily have been her background. And at a university setting, so certainly today would say, well, let me see your credentials. Where's your degree in social work, et cetera.
Exactly.
But at that time, this was a viable opportunity for her, right?
Yeah, it really was. It really was. And she was famous enough that she could do that, she could, her name was so well known. She would compete in air races, and it was very clear there were other female pilots out there who had a lot more experience. Not that Amelia was a terrible pilot; she was a very good pilot, but there were others who were even better than she was. But she was very driven by the whole idea of opening, and she was using her celebrity to open up opportunities for other women, and that seems to have been really driving her.
Well, let's take a look at another character, Jane Austen.
Yes.
Right, and she, you know, and I went through my English literature classes in college.
Right,
and
right.
Jane Austen. So, how do you place her in today's context? Was she a feminist of her time? What do we know about her? What do we learn from her today?
Jane Austen's an enigma because we know so little about her. Her sister Cassandra destroyed many, many, many of her letters to, I'm sure at the time, you know, the delight of her family who wanted her to be remembered a certain way, and the endless frustration of historians today, you know.
That public persona survives, but the private one has been largely destroyed.
It has been largely destroyed. There are things we will never, ever know about her. There's a very opaque reference to some wonderful romance that Jane Austen had at the seaside one time that her sister mentioned in passing years later, and could have been the true love of her life. We know nothing except
not even
this
who it is.
passing note. Yeah, maybe it was this one guy, but we're not really sure. So what I'm doing, and what I decided to do in that program, is focus on what we do know. The one thing we definitely have about her, which are her books. And what was she trying to say? What was she trying to tell us or teach us or get us to think about in her books? So for that program, I portray Jane Austen, but I have her talking, and as she talks, and she's talking about love and romance, you know, the questions people always want to know. Why did she never marry? Was she ever in love? How could she possibly have written so knowledgeably about love if she never was in love herself? You know, these questions.
Right.
You know, when people get to heaven, you know, Jane Austen fans are going to be lining up to say, you know, answer me this. Right. And how did Sanditon end? That was her unfinished novel. Those are the 4 questions. But what I'm kind of saying is Jane Austen could say, look at the books. Look at what I say in the books.
And now in her books, her women are actually powerful within the context in which they operate.
They are.
Which was one of powerlessness. But they understood what power they had.
They did.
And it was through romance.
Yes,
right? That was
and it was through love. And
how they were able to exercise their power.
And that decision about whether to, this is overly simplifying Jane Austen's incredible complexity, but that decision between choosing to marry for love or choosing to marry for money was a really critical one for women. And it was critical for the women in her books, and it was critical for Jane Austen. And when you look at her female characters, and that's what I do, I have monologues, brief monologues from about 8 of her different characters, ranging from Elizabeth Bennet, the heroine of Pride and Prejudice, through Mary, one of the heroines of one of her juvenilia stories. When you look at what she's doing and what she's talking about, and you kind of see them all side by side, you start to realize that what she was saying was, I think, not so much you should marry for love or you should marry for money. What she really, I think, was trying to say to us was, you have to be open to love, however that comes in, and whether it comes to you as you know, love of a husband, love of a family, whatever shape it comes in. You have to have that open heart. That's the real question.
That either of these paths can work out if
yes,
you approach them the right way.
Yes.
That's the message
yes,
that she's getting at?
That I think, and I think that's what she's challenging people to think about, you know. She's challenging people to say, think about, are you open to love? And not everybody is. You know, some people choose for the wrong reasons. Some people have a closed heart and will never love. But be open to it, I think, is what she's urging. So in that one, I'm doing monologues, 8 different women in one show.
So this is going to be a really hard question, I know, but I'm going to ask who your favorite character is, but I'm sure that's not really a fair question. What are your favorite moments about characters?
Oh, gosh, that's such a great question.
That's why I do this show, you know.
This is really good, I know. And let me back up, and I'll say, when someone asks me who's my favorite character, I always say it's the character I'm working on at the moment, because it really is. You know, all of these women are fascinating in their own way, as many historical people are. You know, people are much more complex and fascinating than we often
And they've
think of
survived
them
in
as.
history for a good reason.
They have, yeah. There's a reason, exactly, or the reason we should remember them. But you know, I tend to be very drawn to those moments in history where I think, what would I have done? Titanic is the obvious one, and I do particularly like that program because it puts you in that situation of, what do you do? You're sitting in the lifeboat, you hear people, and you can't go back. How do you deal with that? What do you do? Those are the kind of moments that I tend to be very drawn to, and possibly it's because I'm not so much a comedian in my own life. I was always more, you know, I got into this partly because I was an undergraduate. My undergraduate degree was in theater, so I did a lot of acting in college and back in high school even. And I always tended to be drawn to those drama moments.
Well, history, I think in a lot of perspectives, history is made of those moments.
It is.
What do you do? There's a decision point.
Right.
It can go one way or the other. And,
Yes.
and people don't realize, or maybe they do, that those can have radically different outcomes if you go one versus the other.
Absolutely.
And so I think you're right. That moment of
Yeah.
decision
Yeah,
is how really history is made.
it is.
Do you go forward? Do you go back? Do you go right? Do you
It
go
is.
left?
And there's so many what ifs in life that, you know, your
there's a
life
whole-
can change in an instant.
There's a whole industry of fiction around
Yes,
what if
exactly.
it had gone, you know, the other way.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. It really is. It really is. And
So when you talk about those and those moments, what's the historical lesson? I mean, other than just that they do exist, but that is it to tell people, look, you know, this could happen to you. I mean, you might find yourself having to make a decision that's momentous.
you know, I think to a certain extent, I do that you know, all of us in our everyday lives have fascinating stories and fascinating moments, and the way we make decisions are influenced by who we are and the character of it. And anyone can be famous or unfamous.
Frequently just by the luck of the draw. Fame frequently is a matter
Yes.
of luck as much as anything.
It is. It really is. And sometimes people who do not achieve incredible fame have the most interesting stories. And I'm thinking here specifically of Mary Chestnut, because she is, historians would say, if you want to know the Civil War, you've got to read Mary Chestnut. Some magazine was picking, you know, the four most influential writers of the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, you've got to put up there. Frederick Douglass, for what he had to say about slavery and its role in the American character. Harriet Beecher Stowe for Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Mary Chestnut.
Interesting. She
Now,
ranks in the top 4.
She ranks in the top 4. She's that good a writer, and what she's saying is that important. She kept this diary for 4 years of the war.
So this will have to be quick. We've got about 30 seconds
Oh my goodness.
left.
Oh my goodness. Anyway,
Yes.
barely remembered today, and yet she was there on the front line. Always makes me think of how do we not remember her more? Historians
First-person
do.
history.
It's first-person history.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any of us could be Mary Chestnut. Our diaries could, you know,
Could be famous someday.
be famous or
Well,
not.
Leslie, thank you so much for coming on. It's been fascinating.
Yeah,
And I
thanks
hope
for
you'll
having me.
come back and talk to us again in the future.
Thanks.
So thank you for watching Public Perspective once again. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us on Comcast Channel 19 every Saturday night at 8, and you can find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.